Welcome to Future Sense Now, where we explore the landscape and byways of our shared futures. An e-zine of the Futures Forum live online. We exchange ideas, information, and inspiration about the futures we want. Get Future Sense Now with host Dr. Claire Nelson, futurist and editor of Human Futures.
Greetings and welcome to Future Sense Now, an online e-magazine of the Futures Forum. February is Black History Month, and we're having conversations on the future history of Black America. Specifically, we're exploring how Blacks in America might be faring in the year 2030 and beyond. And why 2030? Well, in the United States of America, by 2030, it is said we're going to be a majority-minority population country. We also know that by 2030, more than likely, we'll no longer be the world superpower, so economic things will be shifting. Also, for 2030, United Nations have developed 17 Sustainable Development Goals that they're asking all countries to try to get to. And of these, Sustainable Development Goal 10 has special meaning and significance because it focuses on inequality, which is a major bugbear of Blacks in America. So we want to see how these shifts might affect us. In this episode, I'll be talking to Dr. James Pope. He's an associate professor at the Winston-Salem State University, a notable historically Black college and university. And I must give him a shout out for his book, his new book, An Africana Reader. This is an anthology of socio-political thought and cultural resistance. So this is why I thought, oh my God, I had to have him on this conversation. So let me jump right in. Welcome, James. How are you in this COVID era?
Oh my goodness, I'm doing wonderful. I'm doing quite well, considering the conditions, right?
Yeah, we all have to rethink. And so I think your work globally, you do a lot of work in the Pan-African space. You're traveling to Latin America, to Africa. And I really thought your perspective might be very helpful as we begin to sort of create an ecosystem of thought of what this future history looks like. What will we be celebrating in Black History 2030, in other words, right? And, having you sort of be one of the people I'm doing this year, and certainly from this perspective, I think is really going to add some rich things that I haven't heard before. So let me just jump right into it. 2030, we're talking about supposedly pre-COVID, 8 billion people, right? Who knows now with the disease, what that might look like. AI will be ubiquitous everywhere. Internet of Things, which thank God without that, we wouldn't be able to have a life in today's world. So unemployment, we're assuming will be very high because we're facing that right now. How are we going to bring it down and make it livable? Unions, that's shifting, We thought they'd be all have disappeared. No, they're coming back because people are finding that they need to have somebody to speak on their behalf. So a lot of things are shifting and have been shifting. And I really would like to know, as you think about it from your vantage point, as somebody who's looking out at the world of Black people, not just in America, but let's start with America and go out, right? What do you think of 2030? And in this case, I guess you have your own internal mirror that you're reflecting 2030 to yourself, right? You put yourself there, you reflect it to yourself. And given the history of the past 4 years especially, and where we are now in the COVID era, at first glance, your first move, what should the Black community be doing in order to move the needle of disparity towards the angle of flourishing?
Wonderful question. And I spend a lot of time, as you say, really thinking about this and really studying the question that you pose. And there are many strands of thought that you have in that particular question. And on the first thought, particularly in the context of my travels, going to Bahia in Brazil, going to places outside of Nairobi in Kenya, going to Cuba, one of the things that immediately popped into my mind, and it's very interesting because you're talking about a future concept, but also how we're thinking about the past. And in that, I really think that people in the community of Africa are what we call African descent, or Africa itself, really need to kind of look back to cooperatives, look back to collective communities and collective processes of how to build community on a global level, which is something that goes back to some of the notions of Pan-Africanism, the idea, which we call a small p, but then the institutionalization of the big P, which we call big P Pan-Africanism, the institutionalization of that. So to be honest with you, I really like the way that you framed your question. I really like the strands of thoughts that you put into there, because a lot of what's going on is cyclical. A lot of what's going on in the context of the past 4 years is not too much different in the context of what has been going on in the past 400 plus years. As far as white supremacy, as far as it reconsolidating itself at different junctures in time and space, whether we have the anti-colonialist movement, whether we have the anti-apartheid movement, or whether we have anti-Jim Crow, is that we also see that the forces who intend to keep people, particularly Africans and people of African descent, as in a position, a social, political, and economic position, they reconsolidate itself at those junctures in response to resistance to those structures. So again, we have to look back at what folk were doing across the African world, not just in the United States, but across the African world, and pull on those strands, those thoughts, those practices that really was centered in community, that really was centered in a collective understanding of who we are in relation to each other, but also nature and the universe.
Yeah, I really want to jump off from your point of the collective and the cooperative. So we know that the cooperative movement in America, certainly in the farming community, is alive and well. We know that the cooperative movement in terms of credit unions are alive and well. However, we have not yet seen really a burgeoning move in the cooperative movement, even from a credit union perspective in the Black community. We have had several Black bank failures, right? Or consolidations. We're down to very few. And those things that we have seen arise have been more like, a celebrity-driven card that supposedly is going to teach us financial literacy. And I have issues with that, right? We have payday lending as a major scourge. So how would you see, if we're creating the future history, I'm going to drag us, none of us are experts on this, but that's okay, we can dream, right? So how would you see, we have a payday lending problem. What could we create in a cooperative way, you think, using the assets that we have, right, to address that problem? And I'm going to drop it. And what then should the governments, local governments, be doing? In other words, now that we have an opportunity, 2-year turning radius, right, to convince people that socialism, quote unquote, is not communism. What can we do with cooperatives in this particular space of payday lending? Is a big problem for the working poor who don't have any pay right now anyway. But still, let's say they had pay.
Oh wow, that is a wonderful question, because it's very interesting. Let me start my answer, and I'm going to back out. I'm going to kind of scale out my answer to this. And I actually had an opportunity to take students in 2019 to outside of Salvador Bahia in Brazil, in the state of Bahia, and we actually had a chance to visit a quilombo. And in this quilombo, one of the things that they are also, this is not, I don't want to give the viewers and the listeners this fantastical notion that they're not fighting, a number of the same battles they've been fighting for the past 400 years, but also they're fighting new battles, such as multinational corporations coming in, polluting the water, things like that. I make that little note, but what I want to actually kind of highlight here is that it's interesting that you say that there are models here. You're absolutely right. We still have quilombos that are in existence in Latin America. We still have them remnants in the Caribbean. We also have instances of Corporation Jackson in Mississippi, who are attempting to develop these particular spaces. I also want to point out too that these same type of communities, the cooperative communities, are still alive and well outside of the city areas of the African continent. And this is important to understand, because when we're talking about cities on the African continent, is that they are an imposition of a certain type of structure. The way that cities were looked at, pre-colonial on the continent of Africa was much different than how it's operating today. Again, I'm dropping little notes here, but let me back out. Let me scaffold this or structure this, my answer to your question. What can be done? Number one is that we have to disrupt the way that we think about relationships, economic, political, and social. And what I mean by that is that if we really understand what cooperatives were doing in the context of a recent historical past in the United States, but a more longer historical past in the Caribbean, Latin America, and also a longer historical past on the continent of Africa, is that they didn't understand those relationships based upon purely financial exchange of value, meaning that they use different ways of community. They use different ways of structuring community, meaning that they use time as a banking system. They use care as a banking system. They use the way that the community ate together as a banking system. Because again, when we talk about banking system, it is our view of that has been specifically racial capitalist. And I have to shout out a good colleague of mine, Dr. Jared Ball, who's done a lot of, who's been doing a lot of work based upon the work of the failures of Black capitalism, not only in the United States, but also across the world. There's also in 1970, there's people who were talking about this. Vincent Harding was talking about, the failures are the pitfalls of relying upon a capitalist structure to as a basis for economic, social, political advancement in the African world. So I just wanted to make sure that there's a long genealogy, there's a long process of thought here. But one of the things that we can do immediately is that we have to restructure our relationships to each other. Understanding that our value, how we value each other, is based upon a financial exchange. A financial exchange, I do this, you do this. There is, and I know that this is getting into a little bit of what we call philosophy or morals, but I don't think this is different than the conversations that Malcolm was having, that Martin King was having. They're really at that structure, how we relate to each other. But one of those things is really, really disrupt the way that we look at that history. It wasn't the misnomer called Black Wall Street. That's a misnomer for these things, right?
Yes. I'm not sure this relationship is very critical. In my Smart Futures philosophy, M stands for moral metrics, meaningful metrics that will create this flourishing future. And we are so programmed from birth to a particular way of being. It's very hard for us, even though we might want to do it aspirationally, us to really picture and see how this could happen. So let's dig deeper into this, because I think we do have to begin to create these laboratories somewhere. And we know that people in the urban farming movement, for example, are looking at this. Might there be an opportunity for us then, rather than to wait on the federal government and the Biden administration to do something, might there be an opportunity for us to go to local governments where we are large in number sometimes, in cities which are largely, Black, and then the surrounding areas or counties might also be largely Black. They're probably on land, but because we have this relationship to the farm as slavery, bad, farm, agriculture, no, stop, halt, fear, run, away, right? We're not able to even feed ourselves. How then might we use this moment of people out of work, right? Of people, some people who yearn for that sense of being able to control even one thing, knowing that the urban farming movement is actually growing, right? How can we maybe come together? Or what do you see as, what kind of technologies can we use to come together to have a conversation that can move policy towards supporting, within the context of the US now, a stimulus by tax or by incentives or by credits or something that will allow us to move towards these more whole systems where a relationship, what I call my Ubuntu economy, right, would become more viable. as a way of being, an alternative way of living lives of thriving.
And to be honest with you, I think we will be meditating on this question now, because it is a question that we've been dealing with, right?
Yeah.
And so there is a will question here. There's a sense of how we view power here.
Yes.
And what I want to do is disrupt this notion of power. I want us to disrupt this notion of power. And the reason why I'm saying this is because I just said there's a question of will. There's a question of personal and collective will to do this. So if we disrupt this notion of power, there's 4 dimensions to power. Power to, power over, power with, and power within. And we cannot have true power. Any government, any collective, any structure cannot have true power unless you have these 4 dimensions there consistently.
Okay, stop it. So before we go on, so make sure I get them into my skull here. Power over, power in, power with, and power within.
Yes. So power over, you always got it. Power over, correct. Power to, so to do something.
Okay, power to. So I missed that one. Okay. Then power in, no?
Power within. Power within, yes.
Okay. And what's the 4th one?
It's power with, which you got.
Yeah, okay.
You got that, yeah.
So unpack that for me, because it's a very interesting notion. So go ahead now.
Oh, absolutely. So what ends up happening is that the structures within which we are living in today only operates on 2 categories of that power: the power to do something and the power over something. But what happens is that power, or those government structures, or those structures who intend or who are designed to marginalize, are designed to oppress, also understand that there's also a power within and a power with. The power within and the power with is what I talked about a few seconds ago, about like the will to do something. What I'm basically saying is that what has happened, which also you talked about Ubuntu, you talked about what has happened is that African people, even on the continent, have been divorced by that ancient past, right? That ancient past that also determines a future. And it's something that you just said, if we're able to feed ourselves. Thomas Sankara was very important. He was always where's imperialism? On your plate. If you cannot feed yourself, if you cannot sustain yourself. Another scholar who's thinking about this, or who thought about this, he's no longer with us, is Cedric Robinson. He wrote an article that is called the Pan-African Commonwealth. And what he's arguing in this particular article is that we as African people have communities that we actually can have relationships, community to community, across the African world. That requires a within, that requires a will to be engaged, a will to engage other people, but also to see yourself in other people. So if our listeners and our viewers understanding here is that there's barriers here that are artificial, and we have to really start to deconstruct those particular barriers. And what I mean is that if we're really looking at it, yes, local governments are what we look at, and as you know the saying is all international global politics is local, right? So yes, absolutely. What are we doing on the local level? And there are many instances when you're talking about the farming movement. I have a colleague of mine who's thinking seriously about leaving the academy and working directly into farming, which is interesting because this also is a deep ancestral connection to land, to the way that we view land, which is a very ancient concept that actually can determine the future. Because if we change our relationships and understand and go back to, as Amilcar Cabral would say, go back to the source, put our hands in the land, understand what it takes, this also leads to another question of how we redefine work in this particular pandemic, but also in the 21st century, which is another area that I have been really, really, really thinking and also teaching and lecturing on, is that we really have to understand that work, the idea of work, we have to envision a world that work is defined differently. So the question is where do African people fit in this question, this global question, this future question of what it means in the context of work that now we're living in a world that no longer needs work. It no longer needs a certain idea of labor as defined as the economy has changed based upon, you know, technology, artificial intelligence, and things like that, which is also very interesting because this is in contestation to the question or to the thing that you're talking about in the context of in the context of farming. We all need to eat. We all need to be able to.
Exactly.
You see what I'm saying? So you see how these contradictions are here. So we have a movement or a redefinition of work that people are having these conversations. I know that you know that there's conversations going on of a world without work. How does this look in the context of AI? How does this look in the context of the age of information? Which is something that's very, very interesting. So and this is why this forum, and you know, we've had conversations, you know, before this. This is why what you're doing is so important, because these conversations are going on without us, right? These conversations are going on, you know, without our interventions, but also this ancient knowledge. And I say ancient knowledge because it's also what I call ancient future, right? These ancient concepts can project themselves into a future.
Yeah, let me ask you something, because as we go to work, because I know we're going to run out of time just now. We're talking about work then. And what popped up in my head was, okay, so we're not going to have work. And one of my kind of fears is, you know, we're spending so much money already on prison systems. Does that mean we're going to have more people going into prison? And then what does that look like? So when you think about the fact that America already has the largest prison population, and that the majority, if not the majority, too healthy a percentage of those people are people of African descent. When you think about some economic development for some, you know, rural areas have been based on, you know, prisons, and we see this pushback and this prison reform. How do you think we're going to deal with the conversation that the BLM movement has launched about defund police? I mean, crime is not going to go away. We're not going to, because we have a collective all of a sudden saying kumbaya and crime will disappear, right? But how do you think that those social dysfunctions and dis-ease might emerge, and what can we do to lower the causality, right, of people who would not necessarily be tending to those things? I mean, I believe, unfortunately, that some people are born that way, right? So we can't do about it. But a lot of people are caught up in stuff. They're not really born that way. They just, the circumstances force them that way. So I want to lower those people, the causality of those people being dragged. How do you see us being able to use technology or the food movement or this collective movement to allow people to find, you know, safety in the collective, so they don't need gangs, because the collective becomes their gang? How are you seeing that? Have you been thinking about that, writing about that?
No, that's a very interesting question, because there is a class that I designed called that looks at the idea of race in the context of the notion of order, how society uses order, or the concept of order. And what I mean is, specifically, I'm looking specifically at order as defined by what I call a justice system that creates criminals, because that's really what we're talking about. One of the things that I wrote a note down is that what we really need to be, or what we should be, that's normative language, but what we can do is really look at how crime is defined. And so when we're talking about defund the police, and we're talking about, you know, and your question and your provocation is very important, because of most of the people who are in jail today committed first-time offenders, threatening offenses, right? And they're predominantly people of color, poor people, and things like that. And I'll say, actually, let me be clear, people of African descent. Not, you know, that people of color concept is a very murky concept. But what this will do is that it actually will give us a chance to redefine or properly define crime, because, as you said, crime will be here because there are certain instances that people may have certain proclivities, whether it's character or whether it's something that they're doing to commit a crime. But if we really understand what a movement in the context of a collective, what does Ubuntu mean? What does all of these ancient concepts of the collective mean? Is that we also have community and collective processes that also are designed to mitigate or to help out people who may have a proclivity, but also to make sure and take care of those who do not have a proclivity to crime. So you see what I'm saying here?
Yes, exactly. Yeah. I totally get it. And so this is why I asked the question. I know we're going to have to wrap up now, but when you think about the future, what's the future you fear?
Oh, future I fear. That's a very interesting question because I tend to not fear any future.
I should say, when you think about what's happening with technologies, what are the things that keep you up at night then? I should ask it a different way, because I mean, you feel like me, you try not to use the word fear too often.
I got you.
Yeah, but the technologies and the things that are occurring now that if they're not managed well, could create a bigger problem. What are the top, what's the top one or two?
The clear repression of memory. And what I mean is that if you can control the access to information, right? So if you're getting rid of books, you're getting rid of access to actual material writings or material speeches or material anything, and that you're now able to control it with the click of a button, meaning that the access to just say being able to read a book on the Mau Mau movement now is behind a firewall, or now is actually disappearing because you can't find it. My fear is the final nail in the coffin, I should say, of memory, of the separation of African people from that memory. And that's the reason why, for me, community becomes important, collectives come important, you, me, come important, because we are the keepers of that memory. We have to figure out ways to go around these particular
to transmit. Yes, and you know, actually, when you said that, I thought about how information is controlled in certain countries and what has happened even with, you know, the shutdown of certain people, and then parallel reasserting itself somewhere else. So you didn't shut them out for long because they created their own system outside the system.
Right.
So I mean, so really, it's a fascinating concept. Last two questions. I know the answer. I hope. Are you optimistic, pessimistic, or neutralistic about the future, and why? And the final question is going to be: could you share with me your own headline story about the year 2030? What will have happened differently because we began this conversation today? So first question: are you optimistic, pessimistic, or neutralistic about the future?
I am optimistic. I am definitely optimistic.
It's good to only have people in my life who are optimistic. Why are you optimistic?
Well, I'm optimistic because we have a history of optimism. We have a history.
That's why we're still alive, right?
Exactly. You know, so we've done. I often say that, you know, ordinary people became extraordinary through the conditions within which they found themselves, whether it was Latin America, the Caribbean, the Americas, the United States, or whatever, because you already had a civilization of people who created concepts of math, science, language, architecture, cult, everything, right? That things that we can't even, we're still studying ancient ideas, right? We're still studying and trying to figure out, you know, what folk were doing through their material production. So so for me, I'm definitely optimistic because we continuously do this. Right? We continue, we continuously.
We always make, as I say in the church, we make our way out of no way. So what's the headline story? What is your headline story from the year 2030 that you would like to see?
A United States of Africa.
No, okay, I'm gonna have to unpack this a little bit. Because I don't like when people give me headline stories that they haven't had a hand in making happen. So how does James Pope have to move that needle of thought, given that we have certain elements already in play?
Yeah. So one of the things, having the opportunity to travel to the continent and visit places that are not dominant places, right? Not that, I go to Nairobi, I go to these places, but I don't stay in the cities per se, or I go into these what I would call maroon spaces in the cities. And so
have you been into the slum, Kibera?
I've been to, I have strong connections with Kibera. I work with a lot of group, with Kiragocho as well, and Kibera as well, which is also the reason why I'm so optimistic. And I can say because a lot of the young folk who are there, the artists, the social justice advocates who are in these particular spaces, and hopefully our viewers will look at and look at what Kibera is and what it represents. They're making a new world. They're creating a new future. That will take hold across the world, particularly because I see the same thing happening with young folk in Afro-Brazil. When I go to Brazil, in Salvador Bahia, I see the same sensibilities. I see it slowly catching on here in the United States. It's very, very slow because of the immediacy and the violence that is happening, the immediacy and the disruption of the conversations that are getting us to talk about things that are not necessarily the radical, the root of it. We're trying to change this, the symptoms as opposed to the actual problem. So a lot of that is disrupting and keeping a lot of us, but there's enough people here, yourself, myself, other people, younger folk. I have a cadre of young scholars who are in grad school right now thinking. One of the things I would tell them, no, I want you to think about beyond struggle. I want you to think about what does an African world look like beyond struggle. I want us to tap into those ancient practices of future, of thinking about the future, building a future through your thought, your words, your actions, your material expression of culture. And so that's the reason why I'm so optimistic. And I'm also, for me, I'm making connections to those communities. So I'm bringing personal, real, live connections to those communities. So it's not just talk.
May I offer a slight modification to your headlines then?
Yes, yes.
What came up for me was the United Nations of Africa.
I'll take that.
Two reasons why, me justify it, because I didn't want to have the USA, right?
Yeah.
And the UNA, there's no UNA right now, country, right? Yeah. And nations will allow a reclamation of the nations of the Kikuyu and the Yoruba and the Hausa and the, all the other, the Zulu, all these nations that existed before the state, the federal European carved out states. So I am going to say, let us start using the term United Nations of Africa. So now as a scholar, can you repeat it back to me with the proper words, etc.? Because you can probably explain it more than me. You know more about this.
Let me say something right now, and I really appreciate that because I am actually I and a few of us are really bucking against this notion of the nation state as being a European construct. And I actually said, and it's funny because I said it, and it was a misspeak, but I'm also thinking about it in the context of redefining. But I'm gonna agree with you. Let's not even use those concepts. Let's not even use. So no, I agree with you 100%. And interestingly enough, there's a long tradition of people who are actually literally saying what you're saying. Even the nation, Basil Davison talked about the curse of the nation state. So there are people who are thinking about this, not enough, I should say, but absolutely. And this is the reason why I think that what you're saying, and I really appreciate that correction. I accept it wholeheartedly because I actually, in any program that people listen to, I'm actually banging against that notion of the nation state, but this is the reason why I say, and I'm so optimistic, is because a lot of folk, a lot of young people, particularly on the continent, particularly in Afro-Brazil, they're reclaiming their past and redefining their positions or their relationship to this notion of the state. And they're creating something else. They're creating national or nations. They're creating and building upon these collective these collective entities are creating these artist collectives and these musical collectives and all of these particular instances, and they're really defining their own space.
Yeah, I'm going to have to stop and ask you one question and question back home because we have to end. But what does it have to do with Black America?
Because Black America can take lessons or look at, and let me also say this, a lot of what these young folk are doing learned from Black folk, particularly what they were doing here. We have actually started a path where you talk about the Black arts movement, whether you talk about, the concept of the Black power movement, where even when you look at hip hop, when you look at all of these manifestations of what folk were doing here in the United States, every last one of these young folk that I'm engaged with, that's the reason why they love for me to come, is because I also provide things that they didn't necessarily know, that gives them the energy to go search. So when I talk about Robert F. Williams as being the one who was the first one who talked about this notion of armed self-defense, of which by any means necessary, Malcolm picks up a year later. So we're tracing these ideas. And so these young folk on the continent, these young folk in Latin America and the Caribbean, they're hungry for this. Interestingly enough, is here in the United States, it's still there. There are pockets of young folk here in the United States who are hungry, but it's just not enough. But I'm optimistic that if we keep doing our work and we keep pushing and providing that, I'm of the mindset, if you build it, they will come. That's my mindset. And so that's the reason why I say that.
Well, if we build it, they will come. And so I'm going to end it right there. Thank you so much. Yes. We have created the beginning of the United Nations of Africa, yes, or the Alliance of Nations of Africa, which will create this Ubuntu economy that will allow more people to do more better. And it will be well on its way to formation in 2030. Thank you so much, James, for jumping on my bandwagon. And thank you for this very insightful conversation on the future history of Black America. Folks, that's it. Thank you for joining us on Future Sense Now, where we explore salient ideas for sustainable futures. Remember, the future is embedded in the landscape of today. So seize the future and seize the day. And as we say, until next time, safe journeys, but the Jamaican way is walk good.
Thank you for listening to Future Sense Now with Dr. Claire Nelson. Future Sense Now is produced by the Futures Forum in Washington, D.C. For more information, visit www.thefuturesforum.org. Remember, our futures are embedded in the landscape of our present stories. Seize the day, share this story, and share the future.